change and disasters relevance, challenges and future actions. We have prepared for you some interesting presentations, stimulating discussions, and a platform to hopefully promote knowledge exchange and shared learning. Before we begin, a few housekeeping matters to attend to. First, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is recorded and the recording will be available on our website for everyone to view and share. And second, I would like to ask if everyone can keep your video off and microphone muted unless you're invited to speak. This will hopefully help us with the smooth running of the technological aspects of the webinar. Thank you very much for your cooperation. I should begin by introducing myself for those of you who do not know me. My name is Dr. Lubopirkova Morgan, and I'm one of the PRAXIS team that is organizing this event. I'm a research fellow from the University of Leeds with a research interest in perceptions and images. And currently the focus of my work is on disasters such as COVID-19 and climate change, as well as on the more optimistic side, solutions such as artificial intelligence use in digital transformations. As pertinent for this webinar, I have the great pleasure of serving as the chair for today, since I'm one of the 2 research fellows from the PRAXIS team who, along with our partners from Critical, from the University of Edinburgh, ran a series of workshops, collected data, and wrote the report that we're formally launching today as part of this event. The agenda for today will be as follows. We will first hear some opening remarks from Dr. James Fenner from the Arts and Humanities Research Council and Charlotte Marriott from the UK's Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport. In fact, the report we're launching today Francesca just showed and shared the agenda with everyone. I hope you can actually see it. Thank you, Francesca. The report we're actually launching today incorporates project-specific policy briefs prepared by the 9 research projects of the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the UK's Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport, Cultural Heritage and Climate Change Cohort. Next on the agenda, there will be a presentation of the key findings from the report that we're launching. The presentation will also share several key insights from COP27 as summarized by Dr. Francesca Giliberto from PRAXIS and Dr. Rowan Jackson from Critical. We're providing this brief summary of our report and the events of COP27 with this presentation in our aim to bring out the synergies between our findings, the discussions held at COP27, and the opinions of experts and interested parties who have joined us here today. That is why in the third component of our agenda, I will lead a roundtable discussion with a group of pre-selected participants who represent varied viewpoints and can help us build on the existing arguments or take us in new directions. And finally, I will open the floor to all present who also may wish to join the discussion as part of our Q&A session, before closing out with a few summarizing remarks. This event aims to bring together the complex interrelationships between cultural heritage, climate change, and disasters between academic and non-academic stakeholders, and hopefully foster further discussion and collaboration, particularly in terms of how we can improve current heritage and climate change policies and practices. In this effort, the output of this webinar, as we have mentioned to many of the participants and will mention again here today, would also be the preparation of a policy brief that aims to include the lessons learned from this online event and the PRAXIS participation at COP27. So here I would like now to invite our first speaker, Dr. James Fenner, to deliver some opening remarks. Dr. Fenner serves as the Senior Investment Manager for Heritage, Culture and Creative Arts as part of the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Thank you, Dr. Fenner, for being here with us today. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Libba, and thank you also, Rowan and Francesca, for inviting me to speak today. Apologies, my voice is recovering from a cold over the weekend, so do bear with me. But yes, it's fantastic to be here, and it's a fantastic report celebrating the work of the nine projects that AHRC and DCMS have funded. I thought it might be beneficial, and apologies for sort of covering trodden ground here, but just to sort of give some more contextual sort of background information, really, to set the scene, really. In 2020, the AHRC and Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport launched a funding partnership funded as part of the UK Official Development Assistance, ODA, and working collaboratively with other partners such as British Council to support research on how developing countries could respond more effectively to the challenges of cultural heritage resulting from natural disasters and climate change. Proposals were sought which responded in an agile way in order to inform future research and policy in this area, ranging in scope from prevention and resilience to preparedness and response, including emergency response, to living with and adapting to change and or loss. Proposals which explored learning from past cultural heritage emergency responses, or which explore learning or intersections with those responses to risks and impacts upon cultural heritage, and also from other crises such as conflicts and displacement were also welcome. Following the successful call, the 9 projects were awarded as part of a cohort, and in the following year, financial year 2021-2022, a time-limited follow-on funding opportunity was provided to support the extension of projects to enhance that engagement and impact activities and support the sharing of learning across projects. A subsequent second follow-on call was launched this year as a further enhancement of engagement for the projects and impact and supported under the original call. And I think, as I say, I think this report, the impacts, the case studies, the framing of it, with thanks to Critical and PRAXIS, is the sort of the showcasing culmination of all that great work over the last sort of 2 years. I couldn't commend the projects more really, and indeed the great work that Critical and PRAXIS have done. I suppose as one sort of final point really, I should say that we tried to engage the project as much as possible through cohort events, and sort of the policy briefings aspects to this, which sort of triggered this report really, was sort of a culmination of last sort of events that we held last summer of 2021, I should say. And so we're looking at sort of policy perspectives to all this. But yeah, enough from me. I'm quite happy to hand over to my colleague Charlotte. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fenner. Thank you so much for your opening remarks and this wonderful overview of the rationale behind the funding of the Cultural Heritage and Climate Change Cohort, as well as the continuous support that AHRC still provides for these projects and what they stand for. And now I would like to invite our second speaker, Charlotte Marriott. Charlotte Marriott serves as the head of the International Cultural Protection at the UK's Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport. Thank you very much, Ms. Marriott, for being here today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Liva and Francesca, for inviting me here today and to celebrate the publication of the report. The Global Challenges Research Fund was the first collaboration between DCMS and AHRC in international cultural heritage protection. And just to explain a little bit about the funding that program on our side of things, the Cultural Heritage Protection program was established just before the UK's ratification of UNESCO's 54th Hague Convention, which seeks to protect cultural property in the event of conflict. And this is now expanded into protecting cultural property from climate change. So it's really at the heart of projects that are happening here at DCMS. And those urgency grants, which it provided, in this case 9, demonstrate one of the core objectives of the what's now called the International Cultural Heritage Protection Programme, for policy to be informed by the highest calibre of research. And I'm really pleased to say that I've shared the research with Bill Parkinson, the Minister who now oversees arts, heritage and cultural diplomacy policy across DCMS. And I'm also pleased that some DCMS colleagues are on the call now. I did a shout out to the department about this, and there's been encouragement for this research throughout the department from senior leaders. DCMS now has an AHRC funded fellow in our team, so I'm sure Sophia will be keeping the momentum going and improving the public dissemination of academic findings to officials and to MPs alike. A few reflections on this report, if I may, just super quickly, because it puts that objective that I mentioned earlier into practice. And so I'm heading to page 83, lessons for policymakers. And I can see here that there's that call for the improvement of the active co-designing and incorporating of learning into national and local policy making. Well, I just want to say now that we hear you, and I want to take this opportunity to invite PRAXIS to present at the next International Cultural Heritage Protection stakeholder meeting, which brings together ministers, officials, and civil society. We want to understand from the research community how COP27 went, and look forward to the next with an ICHP presence. And I do agree also with the sentiments of the paper that snappy research summaries work best for ministers with little time. I'm so often told to present ideas in that sort of elevator pitch style. So the way that this is being presented, you know, is a very like easily digestible, but obviously with such you know, a high quality research and understanding behind it. So I felt like you played the balance very well. The International Cultural Heritage Protection Programme will run from 2022 to 2025 and shows a definite shift towards the protection of cultural heritage at risk from climate change. The urgency grants, as Dr. Fanna has mentioned, will continue with a further £2 million of investment into research over the next 3 years. And we also hope to develop future projects which will focus on this, but watch this space. My last point, which, if I may, knowing that Stephen's on the line from the British Council, so we'll speak a bit more, but there was a greater number of projects that the Cultural Protection Fund, which DCMS delivers in partnership with the British Council, sought to conserve tangible and intangible heritage impacted by climate change. So I look forward to developing new projects throughout this period, and many of which will have the protection of cultural heritage from climate change at its heart. And I wish you all the very best today with the dissemination of your findings.
Thank you very much, Ms. Marriott. Thank you very much for your presentation and for sharing with us as well a bit about the history from the DCMS side and your support. Also, welcome to your colleagues here as well. We will actually be hearing later from the British Council as well, because we have a representative as part of the panel discussion. And also thank you very much for the invitation on PRAXIS's behalf for inviting us to speak at your event. Thank you very much for that. I will now move us along to the final presentation that will be done jointly by Dr. Francesca Giliberto from PRAXIS and Dr. Rowan Jackson from the Critical Project. The next presentation aims to showcase the key findings from our report on cultural heritage in the context of disasters and climate change, as well as provide a brief summary of several main insights from COP27. Dr. Giliberto, the floor is yours. You're sharing a PowerPoint with us.
Yes, just give me a second. Can you see my slides? Oh, sorry, not this one, this one. Luba, can you confirm that you can see my slide? Okay, and you can hear me well. Okay, so hello everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to launch our latest report on cultural heritage in the context of disasters and climate change. Presenting insights from the DCMS-AHRC Cultural Heritage and Climate Change cohort that has been presented just a few minutes ago by James and Charlotte. So this report was prepared in partnership between the PRAXIS project at the University of Leeds and the Critical project at the University of Edinburgh, and Rowan Jackson, postdoctoral research associate at the University of Edinburgh, will continue my presentation. We will present the second half of this presentation. I don't have a lot of time today to present the report, so my main goal is to give you a taste of what the reports look like in order to encourage you to read the full report, or at least some section of the report that you may find interesting. So what's the scope of this report? So it's really to showcase and to analyze the key findings and achievements of the 9 research projects that were funded as part of this cultural heritage and climate change cohort. In particular, to provide a synthesis analysis of the way they were able to develop effective response to challenges in anticipation of and in response to climate change and disaster impacts while focusing on cultural heritage, both in terms of how heritage has been impacted by climate change and disaster, but also how cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, can be used as a source of climate change mitigation, adaptations, and resilience. Just to say a few words about the variety of the projects, of these 9 projects, they focus on different kind of heritage, ranging from natural and cultural landscapes, vernacular architecture, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, historic town and villages, listed monuments, archaeological sites, but also indigenous cultural practices, for example, and many others. In terms of geographical span, they cover much of the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. So they focus mainly in the global South, and these projects were developed in partnership between UK universities, a research center, and overseas partners. And this collaboration has proved to be fundamental in the implementation of this project. So how did we prepare this report? How did we collect the data that then were included in this report? So the PRAXIS and the critical projects organized a series of workshops with the support of HRC between February and September 2022 in order to understand what were the core themes addressed by these 9 projects, to understand what worked, what didn't work, what were the challenges, what were the methodologies that have been used and implemented, and as well what were the challenges in relation to these methodologies, but also the innovative aspects that are related to using heritage also as a methodological tool, and also to identify the key recommendations to funders and policy. So we had 2 workshops. The first one mainly focused on identify these core themes, while the other one really was more structured. And we asked the 9 projects of the Cohort to present their projects according to 5 key sections. That were then transformed into specific issue briefs that are included in the report. So the report is structured in this way. So it has 1 chapter providing a synthesis analysis of the data that were collected and discussed during the workshops, identified key challenges, core themes, and the methodologies used by this project. Then we have 9 individual issue briefs, one specifically presenting insights from each of these research projects, and they were authored by the project PIs in collaboration with their colleagues and project partners overseas. And then a section specifically focusing on providing lesson learned and recommendations for policy makers. And we really hope that this report will be able to generate an impact on policy making. So I will conclude my first part of this presentation by highlighting some of the core achievements of these projects and the key research findings, in particular highlighting the uniqueness of played by cultural heritage in this context. So the first one is that these projects were able to highlight the need to recognize the plurality of heritage interpretations and values that exist in a specific location affected by climate change and disasters, and how it's important to identify the different values, the different stakeholders associated with the site, especially the most marginalized one, the one that are not often included in the decision-making process. And the recognition of all these different heritage attributes and values, both tangible and intangible, is a crucial step for a comprehensive and inclusive safeguarding of heritage, particularly in the context of disasters and climate, in the aftermath of a disasters and in climate change adaptation. The second point is related to the capacity of some of these projects to bridge the gap that exists, especially in the Western world, in the recognitions of cultural and natural heritage as an interconnected and inseparable element, and the development of more integrated and sustainable approaches to tackling the impacts of climate change and disaster. In fact, the distinction between cultural and natural heritage is very popular in the Western world, and it is reflected in different governmental departments, for example, or in different departments in other organizations which focus on one aspect or the other, while for many communities, and especially all around the world, and in particular many indigenous communities, this distinction doesn't exist, and it's a very limited approach considering them in a separated way and not including them in more integrated and holistic framework. The third point is related to the need of developing people-centered, community-based and participatory approaches using arts and culture. So in order to achieve the first 2 points mentioned before, it's really important to engage with people, in particular those who are the most marginalized and not included in the conversation. And one key aspect of this project was their capacity to assess local knowledge, which is also expert knowledge, in particular in relation to indigenous and community knowledge on the ground through participatory approaches that have facilitated intergenerational and intersectoral knowledge transfer in different geographical locations. Then the fourth point is related to the capacity of this project to build and develop a community of practice on the ground. So the fact that this project were developed and implemented in partnership between UK institutions and local partners was fundamental. Because local partners, they were provided an invaluable support in terms of data collection on the ground, particularly because of their capacity to know the local language, the local culture, and to build trust and engage meaningfully with the local communities. Moreover, this project was also able to build a community of praxis by organizing several knowledge exchange events, including webinars, workshops, at an international level, but also supporting the building of capacity in terms of organizing training courses or joint drafting research outputs together with local partners and local community. So finally, the last point is the ability of this project to improve the way we assess heritage vulnerabilities and risks, and to increase project transferability and scalability based on the research findings, which needs, so what a key aspect is the fact that this innovative way to assess heritage vulnerabilities is the fact that they were able to contextualize this assessment in relation to the locations where the projects were implemented, and so to develop cultural sensitive approaches toward vulnerability assessment and risk assessment tools. So with this, I hand over to Rowan Jackson, who I hope is still here, to provide some insights on the lesson learned recommendations from the report.
Great, thanks very much, Francesca, and thanks to James and to Charlotte for providing the context for this report, because this report and very much the way we structured it could not have been put together without the support of AHRC and the DCMS. So this provides a really important context to the way we structured the workshops as well, that, you know, those cohort sessions, the way in which all of the 9 projects involved in this grant were supported throughout the process. And this, of course, gave us the opportunity to run workshops and to facilitate these discussions. So the lessons learned and the recommendations that I'll present now are actually outputs, of course, from all of the projects. So this is very much coming out of exactly what researchers have said across all of those projects individually, and also from the PIs leading each project. So the lessons learnt are going to cover, in effect, the lessons from the actual process itself of doing the research, and the recommendations are recommendations coming out of the project work that Francesca has already summarised. So when I present the lessons learnt, and there are quite a few here, these are just some snapshots that you can read in far more detail within the report itself. And these came out, particularly the lessons learned came out of the first workshop with each of the PIs and other researchers involved in each of those projects. So you can see from the first lesson that it was about identifying relevant audiences to provide targeted, clear messages to achieve greater impact. And this is about trying to benchmark cultural heritage as having a particular appeal to multiple different audiences, but the need for researchers to very much target their research in the way that we've structured this report to policymakers. So in the form of briefs that are targeted towards relevant departments in governments or different sectors of the cultural heritage sector as a whole. This leads on to the second point, which is about translating into multiple languages. The fact that much of the content from these sorts of reports is often published, of course, in English. So providing sufficient funds in order to allow reports to be translated not just into different languages, but also translated into a format that allows the researcher to communicate the results and to draw attention to the likes of cultural heritage threats. So the impacts of climate change and natural disasters in this case. And in addition to this, with cultural heritage, with this form of research, there's a need to promote these holistic and integrated frameworks that are not just about one approach to cultural heritage being the answer to everything. It's not, of course, just about preservation, for example, maintaining cultural heritage as a static object, often materially based. It's also about acknowledging the broader cultural heritage in terms of intangible cultural heritage, in terms of identities, and in terms of different entry points into how people value cultural heritage over space and time. For example, concepts such as adaptive release, which is a recent concept integrated into practice by Historic Environment Scotland and Historic England, about trying to allow natural forces to cause material decay. So that would be one of the examples. Then, of course, developing flexible financing, and this is very much important in terms of these international collaborations, to try and allow a flexible financing package. And this very much comes from point 8 as well here about learning from COVID-19. COVID-19 actually offered the opportunity to have more flexible conditions in which, in fact, many of the PIs weren't able to go abroad in order to conduct research. So the financing of all of these projects was very much focused on trying to work with teams rather than work in a way that structures all of their practices. So there's more flexibility in the way we did research, but also in the way it needed to be financed. So that's a key lesson for these sorts of international collaborations. And then, of course, with this, to decolonize funding models, to empower stakeholders, to try and think about trying to co-lead projects and to obviously to co-produce research itself, working with participants and very much not just starting necessarily with an initial premise and then focusing on that in the field, but also trying to find out what the problems are, what the challenges are for cultural heritage locally, and integrating those into the actual research framework actively throughout the project. And then finally, the final 3 points, which are about impact and learnings, really. So we've got the co-design of policy and the co-design of research. It's about trying to work with research to co-design policy locally, and that goes along with the likes of translating for multiple different audiences. It's also about trying to create sustainable and impactful research. So trying to use these sorts of research projects as a way to actually to persist with a key theme that the likes of AHRC or the DCMS might pick on over multiple years, rather than just going with a new concept that's of interest. And that's certainly something that's happened with the multiple funding rounds of these projects. They're able to continue with key themes, with key areas of focus. And then finally, of course, looking back on all the projects, learning from the impacts of COVID-19, and of course, not just learning from the impacts of COVID-19 as a negative, but also thinking about the positive effects that this had in terms of perhaps balancing power relations within research groups, trying to work out a more equitable dynamic within research overall. So of course, please do read these in more detail in the report itself, but now we'll go on to the recommendations. I don't think I can control the slides here, so if Francesca could click to, oh, there we go.
Yes,
Excellent.
I changed it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. So the recommendations are now based upon the actual research itself. So Francesca presented this 3 slides ago. So if you cast your mind back to those project outcomes, these are some summaries based upon the presentations in that second workshop about what we could learn from cultural heritage itself, from the actual research in the field. So of course, as Francesca's already covered, there was recognizing the existence of multiple heritage assets and their significance to diverse communities. This is very much something that's within critical cultural heritage, but very much needs a critical dimension to it in the context of climate risk and the risk of natural hazards. Thinking about multiple forms of heritage asset, whether it's material or immaterial as those intangible cultural assets, but also thinking about diverse communities, trying to be critical of the term community itself. Who are we targeting, who are we representing, and who as a result of that might not be included within what we choose to study in the field. So thinking carefully about how we work with communities and co-produce that knowledge, who is potentially excluded and whose heritage are we representing. Then in terms of supporting local groups and especially minority groups to make their own decisions, this goes with that point. It's to say that we need to work with local groups, but we also need to make sure that those local groups are not simply seen as representing the entire community in inverted commas. So we need to be careful about who, of course, is included and who we give power to in the field. Then, of course, making data open access and accessible, particularly to the groups that we're working with, and of course, those who we might identify as key stakeholders. So not simply putting it in a data repository that they can't get access to, of course, making it open access, but also retrievable in a format that's useful for those who we're working with. Then, of course, also starting to work bottom up, not just looking top down, looking at frameworks that we can apply in different locations, but looking at ways in which we can start to balance perhaps some form of unifying framework that works in multiple contexts and empowers local actors. So, for example, Will McGarry's work on the CVI framework, the Climate Vulnerability Index work, which very much works with local groups and tries to have an input from those local groups within an existing framework. Then, of course, understanding risks to cultural heritage requires an effective dialogue. This goes along with the previous points about lessons learned of co-producing knowledge and working with policymakers. So identifying stakeholders from the start and trying to develop an effective dialogue that produces impactful research. That's effectively what this point is trying to draw attention to. And with this, of course, also building in, perhaps within those funding models, emphasis on education and outreach. How are we going to make this research impactful for multiple audiences, but also across multiple generations? How can we use heritage as an asset with which to tell stories locally and of local relevance, especially in the context of climate change? And then, of course, working with multiple organizations, such as in the Quadrangle project that you'll see from Brazil, the Iron Quadrangle, working with multiple creative arts and crafts and traditional practices to look at climate action through multiple different mediums and lenses. And then, of course, through looking through that, not just shutting projects down, but funding successful projects over multiple multi-year cycles, not just saying, well, there's the project and it's successful, that's great, but trying to continue these key themes over multiple years. And of course, by continuing and persisting with key research themes that are successful, we might then be able to design more robust risk tools and methodologies that really address challenges, not just in academia, the academic challenges of sort of theorizing, but also working with heritage managers and policymakers to improve the outcomes for heritage in the context of climate change and natural disasters. And with that, I'll hand back to Francesca to talk about COP27.
Yes. Okay, so I think we have just run a little bit over time, so I will try to be brief. Just saying a few words about PRAXIS participation at COP27 earlier this month, and in particular as part of the Climate Heritage Network. So PRAXIS is a research project, but it's also part of the Climate Heritage Network, which is a voluntary mutual support network of over 200 organizations all around the world, including government agencies, NGOs, universities, business and other organizations which are really committed to taking climate change and achieving the ambitions of the Paris Agreement, which is a legally binding international treaty on climate change with the goal of limiting global warming up to 2 degrees Celsius, preferably less than that, and up to 1.5. So unfortunately, this year, PRAXIS was not able to organize any physical events at COP27, while last year we organized a few, 3 virtual or hybrid events for COP26. But we have been following the series of events that members of the Climate Heritage Network have organized as part of COP27, both within the Blue Zone, which is the United Nations area of COP27, which with COP means the Conference of Parties, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, and the Green Zone, which is another areas where other observers, organizations, and members of the civil society can organize events. So this year at COP, the Climate Heritage Network was able to organize more than 20 events focusing on a variety of aspects related to cultural heritage and climate change, focusing both on the impacts that climate change is having on cultural heritage, but also on how cultural heritage can be effectively mobilized for climate change adaptation and mitigation. So there, I will not go into the details, but there were events focusing on vulnerability assessment with Salma Sabur, who was one of the representatives of delegation of 5 African researchers and practitioners who wanted to share their own experience and research based from their countries in Africa, and in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. Others focus on the intersections between culture, climate, and gender. Other on the loss and damage that we are facing in relation to culture and heritage, while others also focus on how we can build adaptations and foster resilience by using heritage and culture. The majority of this event was organized as part of the Resilience Hub at COP27, which is a physical space managed by the COP presidency. So it's an official space of COP27, and it's where I think these events and the outcome of these events were more effective. In addition, the Climate Heritage Network has also launched a manifesto that you can sign if you want after this event. I can share the link in the chat, aiming at raising awareness about the importance of cultural heritage in the context of climate change and to foster cooperation and synergies across organizations. I would like to conclude by highlighting what I think emerged, the key aspects that emerged at COP27 in relation to cultural heritage, in particular the key achievement of the cultural heritage sector in this framework. So the first one is the fact that this COP has seen the strongest presence ever of arts, culture and heritage in a conference of parties. The second one is that as part of these events that I was mentioning before, one of them was a really high-level ministerial event on cultural heritage-based climate solution. It was the first of this kind in the 10 histories of COPs, and it has seen the presence of the Ministries of Cultures and Environments in Egypt, Ministry of Culture of Jordan, and also the Minister of Culture of the Emirates. Supporting and at a political level the importance of cultural heritage in the context of climate change. But what I think has been the greatest achievement has been the inclusion for the first time, again in history, of cultural heritage in a final decision at COP27. So for the first time in the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation 1, which is a final decision agreed by the member states of the United Nations, cultural heritage has been recognized as an element of loss, particularly in the most vulnerable countries, in these final decisions, together with the loss and damages associated to forced displacement, human mobilities, and the loss of lives and livelihoods of local communities. And this was included in a paragraph in a section related to loss and damage. And the other important achievement is that a new loss and damage fund for vulnerable communities hit by climate disaster has been agreed by the member states. And this will support, the loss and damages in relation to cultural heritage now. And this was an achievement also made possible by the fundamental role that indigenous representatives have played in this COP. So I would like to thank all the representatives of the Climate Heritage Network that have pushed so hard for including cultural heritage in this context. But I would like to say, and this is food for thought for our discussion later, is this is enough? I don't think so, because it's true that cultural heritage is an element impacted by climate change, but I also think it's a really a useful resource in order to fight against climate change, and there is so much work to do in relation to that. So thank you very much, and hand over to Luba, who is looking at me because I overrun again. Thank you.
No, that's all right, Francesca. Thank you both for the very interesting presentation of our report, highlights and useful lessons. Also, thank you very much for the summary of the key points from COP27 that we wanted to raise. This presentation in a way serves to place a certain frame of mind, frame of thought, or to say a direction of sorts on our subsequent discussion with the panelists. So next we'll actually proceed to take some of these points raised as part of this presentation and to make them as the starting point of our discussion with our invited speakers. I would now like to ask our panelists to join us and unmute yourselves, as well as share your video. As I invite you to the table, may I please ask that you each tell us a little bit about yourselves, your research interests in your project. Thank you very much. And to start, I would like now to invite Dr. Bernadette David and Dr. Alan Forrest as representatives of the principal investigators of the projects from the Cultural Heritage and Climate Change Cohort. Dr. Bernadette David comes from the Centre of Architecture, Urbanism and Global Heritage from Nottingham Trent University, while Dr. Alan Forrest is a biodiversity scientist from the Centre for Middle Eastern Plants in the Royal Botanic Garden of Edinburgh. Could you both now please share a little bit about yourselves, your research project and the future directions of your work? Could we start with Dr. David?
Hi, thank you. Well, I'm Bernadette David. I've been working around how to tackle post-earthquake reconstruction of heritage areas in Chile since an earthquake in 2005. And I've continued developing these different approaches to that for different earthquakes and how to use advanced recording technologies and digital technologies to enhance those processes of reconstruction and enhance the processes of repair instead of complete replacement of houses, especially in heritage areas. And this is, I've been working in Chile for my PhD, and now I'm working thanks to this grant in India, in heritage areas of India, specifically in Gujarat. And for this project, it has been a collective effort with project partners in India, in Gujarat. And the main thing to say about this is the opportunity to work with them and to understand the process of research with them. So it is a stakeholder, like the project created a replica of a real stakeholder situation that will happen after an earthquake. So we have NGOs from India that are actually the ones that are carrying out the works there in case of an earthquake. Also universities, which are actually applying different research for this, and also the Gujarat Institute of Disaster Management, looking at the policies implemented. So it has been a very round project, and basically the issue brief presented in this spectacular report, which I think is really well summarized. It's basically talking about introducing technology to break the unsustainable cycle of building replacement after earthquakes towards a culture of reuse and risk mitigation that go towards this idea of maintaining the cultural heritage beyond the buildings themselves, but also understanding the role of the communities on that. Sorry, maybe too long.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davila. I will definitely give you more of a chance later to explain further as part of the discussion. Dr. Forrest, could you also share a little bit about yourself, your research interests in your project?
Sure. So my name's Alan Forrest. So I should really get this one out of the way. A botanic garden working on cultural heritage, tangible, intangible heritage, often raises eyebrows. We have a really big interest, particularly in Socotra, where this project was based in the relationship between cultural and natural heritage, as was pointed out previously by colleagues here. The people on Socotra don't recognise that difference. It makes no sense to them. The program here that we worked on really was focused on Socotra. It is an isolated archipelago that is part of Yemen. It's received a lot of funding about its unique biodiversity, and it's been almost entirely ignored in terms of its cultural heritage and the relationships between the two in any sort of formal funded programs, protected areas and conservation management. And fundamentally, my interest has been trying to bridge those gaps, but not at that formal drawing lines on maps type of area and including cultural heritage sites, but working really from communities up through locally trained experts and to the relevant authorities, both on the island nationally and regionally. But we were starting from scratch, and through a range of programs, even prior to this one, we were working with local people, with my colleague Julian Jansen van Rensburg, who is here in the audience, to make sure that there was a team of people that were really committed and trained to document in all its forms, and then to realize that all of these millennia of traditional knowledge of land management really might have a lot of relevance for coping with climate change, because that's what it was designed to do, primarily to do with water availability. And speaking to communities to work out what their experience and knowledge of climate was, how they managed it, how it's changing, what their understanding of those changes are, and the values they place on their traditional knowledge. And sometimes there were little gaps in that knowledge that came from both sides as well, and that led on to some of the recommendations we make. The project isn't finished; it's still going on. We're still out there speaking to people and presenting ideas and discussing ideas. And I hope I can provide a little bit more detail, perhaps if people are interested later on. If you want to know more about Socotra, please go online. It's very, very easy to find if you look hard enough.
Thank you very much, Dr. Forrest. Next, I would also like to invite Dr. Yanko Cha and Dr. Samus Sabor as representative of project partners to the climate change cohort. Dr. Cha is a postdoctoral research associate from the School of Geosciences from the University of Edinburgh and part of the Critical Project. And Dr. Samus Sabor is a postdoctoral researcher from the University of Southampton and part of the CPI Africa project. Could you both now also please share a little bit about yourselves, your research project, and the future directions of your work? Could we start with Dr. Cha?
Hi, thank you for introducing me. My background is more about climate change adaptation governance. So I used to work in setting national adaptation planning in South Korea and the UK, especially for the Scotland, how the city reason managing in risk assessments or the climate change adaptation in order to build a capacity to deal with climate change. And then end of last year, I've got a great opportunity to join the critical team to work with our research partners. So critical project, we aim to understand better the role of heritage within risk assessments through the investigation of 3 case study sites. The small-scale settlements of Inland Sklof in South Africa and the city region of Yogyakarta in Indonesia and the national approach across Sri Lanka. So our research team delivered findings, and then we represented through using ArcGIS story maps, and then we put all our research findings on e-learning course materials, which is free and open to everyone. And I'm sure we can share the link later. And then this year, the phase 2, we are going to share these findings with the broader stakeholders in local area and in local languages as well, with trying to feed back to the policymakers, how can we bring this legacy to sustain and then make policy to take account of actually thinking about the local level, what they need and what their risks they got in order to build their own resilience for their communities and nationwide as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cha. Dr. Sabor, could you now also tell us a little bit about the CPI Africa project and the future directions of your work?
Yeah, thank you, Luba. Thank you, Francesca, for the invitation. First of all, I'm really happy to be here with all of you. I'm already learning so much, discovering about your work. Myself, I'm right now, so I've been working on the Climate Vulnerability Index Africa as a dissemination manager at the end of the project, actually, which was a project of capacity building in 2 World Heritage sites. I don't like the word capacity building, but I would say infrastructure of knowledge building in those 2 World Heritage sites, where there has been the inclusion of local communities and managers and local authorities in the development of what vulnerability to assets and values means. And this was based on a process for the assessment of the vulnerability of World Heritage Site that was developed in Australia by John Day and Dr. Scott Heron as well. My interest is mostly on working on this gap area between the natural and cultural heritage worlds. I've done my PhD on the assessment of risk from climate change, and more specifically sea level rise, erosion and flooding in coastal natural world heritage sites worldwide, with a focus on the Banc d'Arguin National Park, which is a site in Mauritania, a desert wetland, which has incredible natural values. But through my work and focus groups, interviews with managers and indigenous local communities, what I found is that this separation between natural and cultural was necessary actually to categorize and work deeper, specialize in some elements. But at the end, it creates also issues in actually evaluating risk and evaluating vulnerabilities, especially when you have designation like UNESCO, and when managers are dealing with managing outstanding universal values, while actually the sites have much more other local values than those outstanding universal values. And right now I'm doing actually a half-time postdoc in relation to compound flooding in Vietnam, in introducing the elements of values and heritage into highly like hydrodynamic models of cyclones and tides and sea levels. And at the same time, I'm actually starting a project soon that will be launched in the new year with the Climate Heritage Network, ICOMOS, and National Geographics, which I will not say the name, it's a surprise. But it will be actually a project that will aim to develop collaborative engagements between local communities, site managers, and other stakeholders in finding ways to integrate scientific knowledge, local knowledge, and indigenous knowledge about climate change, and from that going towards thinking and planning for adaptations in 10 heritage sites around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sabor. To invite our fifth panelist to the table, Stephen Stenning from the British Council. Mr. Stenning is the Global Director, Culture in Action. We're honored that you're here with us today, Mr. Stenning, and thank you very much for your participation. Could you please also briefly introduce yourself and your work to the panel?
Thank you. Yes, I will. This is very exciting. Hello to everybody, and I don't think I've been surrounded by so many doctors before without being hospitalized. I certainly don't know how to answer the question about research interest, because I'm neither a researcher and definitely not an academic, but the connection to this, as Charlotte mentioned earlier, partly in response to signing the Hague Convention, that a cultural protection fund was started in 2016, at which time I was working in the Middle East for British Council, based in Cairo. And so the connection very much is that cultural protection fund, initially a £30 million fund that was launched in 2017, and in response to what was going on in Syria and Iraq, particularly, but the wider region around it. But in response to really about protecting cultural heritage that was at risk because of conflict. Over time, with that fund having been seen as impactful and successful, there is, and I think actually impactful and successful because a number of things that have come out through the report, and reflecting on that, as we undertook the sort of mammoth task of starting up the Cultural Protection Fund, there's that sense, as with any initiative like that, of wouldn't it be great to have been able to do more research, mapping, and really understanding the picture before you launch something like that. And looking at it's a shame that chronology has happened in the way it has. It would be great to have some of the insights that come through that report beforehand. But oddly enough, a lot of the things that it's highlighting and recommending about bottom-up approaches, about understanding local context and the relevance of local context, and even seeing heritage in a slightly different way, have bbeen really manifest in the way that the Cultural Protection Fund has developed for various reasons that I can touch on later. But the main, I suppose, the main other area of connection to this is that the fund itself, now having been benefited from a further investment from the UK government at the last spending review, is now looking very much more at heritage that's at risk because of climate change, and also looking at that space between heritage, climate change, protection, just as the report that's been highlighted. In fact, we've just awarded a large grants round, 40% of which has gone to projects that are looking to protect heritage at risk because of climate change. That's some 6.7 million in the last round. There are connections there, including with Socotra, as mentioned, and also even a botanic gardens working with Socotra. But also, we are looking at a What Works program alongside it, a What Works program that looks to support better outcomes for cultural heritage protection in local communities, and passing on the sort of best available evidence to practitioners and decision makers. So there's an obvious connection there as well with the work of what I think is an excellent report.
Thank you very much for your words, Stephen Stenning. Can I now invite our final panelist, Catherine Childs, who is an environmental scientist from the Cayman Islands. Before I actually ask her the question, I'd like to share that I actually met Ms. Childs at COP27, and after a discussion about our report and the current work at PRAXIS, I came to realize that we had so far not engaged with an overseas territory perspective. And Ms. Childs shared some very interesting perspectives with me during our time at COP. And that's why we're extremely honored that she accepted our invitation to be here with us today and hopefully share some of her thoughts with this panel as well. Thank you very much for being here today, Ms. Childs. Could you also introduce yourself and the work you do?
Of course. Good morning or good afternoon for you guys, I suppose. My name is Catherine Childs. I work for the National Trust for the Cayman Islands, and I'm the Environmental Programs Manager. So what I do is I try to save Cayman's natural heritage, which I think the connections that Indigenous communities and local people have with their natural world is underappreciated by people from Western societies. As Alan Forrest here suggested a minute ago, it's really hard, I think, for people who've grown up in this Western world where we don't have a connection in some obvious ways to the natural world to understand how deeply entwined cultural heritage is with the natural world. There's a connection there that can't be forgotten about. And as Luba was referring to, we started talking about what's happening in the overseas territories. I mean, colonialism is still occurring. Now, the Cayman Islands is happy to have the involvement of the UK. It's great politically to have the stability of that. We're not complaining about that, but the UK makes all these promises on the world stage about $100 billion in climate finance, about stopping deforestation around the world, but they're not doing any of those things in their own overseas territories. So we just need to see some, money where their mouth is kind of thing to make sure that the overseas territories get some assistance from the UK. When we were at COP27, I try to go every year with some young Caymanians to try to prepare the next generation for what is going to happen here in this very vulnerable country. We went to the UK pavilion and we sat and watch Lord Goldsmith give a presentation. You all probably know he's famous for being very aware of station and all those things. And the day we thought, fantastic, this is our guy, he's going to really understand our position. So we went and watched him, and they brought in people from the Amazon region, they brought in people from Southeast Asia, they brought in people from Africa that all did a great job talking about what's happening in their countries. But when we tried to have a meeting with him, he had no time for us. So it just made us feel that this is indicative of what's happening. It's much there's an awareness that the people in the Amazon really need to be listened to, and they do. But what about the overseas territories? We are fighting this losing battle, and it feels like we're not getting a lot of help. Now, I was glad to read this report and to see that there's so much emphasis on helping countries with funding avenues, because that's a huge problem. As Salma said, I don't really like capacity building either. It has a little bit of a, patronizing tone to it. A lot of the people here are just as able, just as educated, just as willing to do the work, understand the work. But we don't necessarily have all the time to do everything that's necessary. We were given offered a grant by the EU to do climate literacy projects in local schools. It was a grant that I wrote. But we almost turned it down because what they required was so onerous. It was almost impossible to fulfill what that grant required, as far as writing it up, opening separate bank accounts, which is impossible in the Cayman Islands, by the way, because of all the finance laws that are out there. Just all these things that people aren't aware of when they're sitting in an office in the UK or in Brussels or wherever it is. So having a better understanding about what's happening on the ground in some of these areas would really help. And so I was really happy to see that in y'all's report. I think it's a very, very good report that analyzes the problems in such a way that I think you've really hit on some of the major issues that need to be addressed, and how to overcome some of them. So my congratulations to all the authors of this project.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I guess I will delve straight into my first question from here, because I can continue off of what you were saying. In what way do you guys, anyone from the panel, think that we can possibly bring more voices to the table in the discussion surrounding heritage assets and their significance for diverse communities, as well as incorporate them in the discussions about risk tools and methodologies, kind of whose voices are still perhaps left unheard or not heard of enough? After all, understanding risk to cultural heritage does require an effective dialogue with relevant stakeholders. So who are these stakeholders, and how can we actually bring them forth and incorporate them in this discussion from your own perspectives and your own projects and your own work? Who would be brave enough to start?
Well, I'll start. So I go every year to the COP with young people from the Cayman Islands, and it's I feel extremely fortunate to be able to do that. But I'm very lucky because Cayman Islands is home to a lot of big corporations, and I'm pretty good at fundraising. So I can go to these corporate people and get them to give me money so that we can take our young people internationally so they can see what happens in these big international climate meetings. Most people can't do that. All the other overseas territories, none of them were represented with young people except for this one determined young man that comes and finds the money somehow. So it's helping the local communities get to things like that so that their voices can be heard, so they can see what's happening at the global stage, because sometimes you don't realize until you've gone, your eyes are kind of opened about what conversations are occurring, and what it means to you and what you need to do to steer those conversations in a way that that can affect your home in a better way. So I saw that happening at the COP, but when you look at, it's so inspirational every time I go to see the young people, especially working so hard to make a difference and then being listened to as well. But to get more of those people to those kinds of meetings, I think would be really helpful for, I don't know where that money is coming from, but that needs to happen so that their voices can be heard on the global stage. And they can experience what's happening in the world themselves and take that back to their homelands. I think that would be very helpful.
Salma has her hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Luba. I just wanted to add to what Catherine said, like for this COP with the Climate Heritage Network, we also crowdfunded to be able to bring 4 heritage managers in Africa to COP. However, I had a lot of discussion with Andrew Potts about the differences between your first COP and your second COP. And I think one of the really important thing is actually trying for people to be there a second time or a third time, because the first COP is so overwhelming that actually it is not that moment where you can actually really engage as much as you can. It's so you're discovering, and it's really important to kind of actually keep it going and bringing people at least a second time there and supporting their travels and things like that. I think in engaging with communities, languages are so important in the fact that if you can work with a community that with whom you can speak the local language, it's make it completely different the way you understand their perceptions, because translation itself don't take off a lot of values and meanings that are in the languages that we can't perceive. So I think and this is then really important as like from the academic perspective, working with local researchers and having like true collaborations with local researchers and not having just their name, you know, somewhere in the project saying that we're working with them, but actually I think to get to the communities as a researcher from, you know, super far away from in another place in the world, it's really important to engage with researchers, truly creating like proper collaborations and also engaging in this discussion before the projects and before the research questions are there. So really developing from the beginning an inclusion of these elements in the writing and the description of specific projects.
Thank you very much, Salma. I think Stephen had his hand up next.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to follow on a little bit from what the previous 2 responses. I think really important to bringing in different voices and understanding different perspectives is really sort of being willing to open up to different understandings of the role that cultural heritage plays and even what cultural heritage is. I referred earlier with the starting of the fund to what I see as things that really resonate with what's coming out of the report. And I think some of those came from the starting point of the Cultural Protection Fund not being one of heritage experts or huge knowledge in cultural protection. And what I mean by that is that so British Council became involved in putting together that fund, not because we are experts in heritage or cultural protection, far from it. We very obviously weren't, but had a network of offices and a presence that in most cases dates back 80 years plus in 100-odd countries. And along with that, and probably, you know, surprise to many, is that most of the staff of British Council are then local to those offices. So there is a connection to those countries and a connection to various organizations, NGOs, cultural organizations and others in those countries. And so I think because of that, because also at the time, the support we were getting into how might you put together a fund was from organizations like the National Lottery Heritage Fund themselves, just looking into sort of community-based practice and what turned into Kick the Dust. And also the kind of accident of it being development assistance fund. I mean, I don't mean the accident that it was development assistance fund, but the accident that comes with that of needing to look very carefully at local benefit. So the end sort of result of that is that you need to challenge yourself on what is heritage in the first place. And as Catherine was saying earlier, that there's the Western view of heritage is not necessarily the one you have in countries where projects are working. And so you have to be adaptable and willing to understand heritage in the first place in a different way, but also not to see it purely as a distanced or academic exercise, but recognize that cultural heritage is part of contemporary culture and is also, as highlighted in the report, can provide approaches that are going to be important for things like adaptability. So then I think that throws up a whole different sort of perspective on who are the experts as well. Many of the cultural protection fund projects are intangible heritage ones. So you're talking about things that are, let's say, traditions or customs or practices. So who is the expert in those? Somebody who's studied them for many years at a Western university, or the people who are practicing them daily, and it is very obviously shaping their lives and the understanding of the world around them. So I think those aspects, the sort of aspects of being willing to look at what is the heritage, how we understand it, where it fits into the context, and the part it plays in contemporary culture is a vital part of getting in those different voices and also questioning who are the experts in the conversations you're having.
Thank you very much. Can I now invite Alan? He also has his hand raised. And,
Thanks, Lou. But see, the problem is after you speak after 3 or 4 other people, you have to really restrict yourself and not answer all of those questions and take up the next hour and a half just with me talking. No, just really quickly. In terms of attending the COP, so I haven't ever attended a climate COP. I'm just back from the CITES COP in Panama, which was quite overwhelming as a first attendee. Plenty of money to get people there. It's getting the right people there. I don't know how it works with the climate COP, but the sponsored delegates fund for CITES had about $600,000 in order to support people from countries like Yemen to attend, but a single delegate. Bringing people, so bridging that gap from there right down to communities on Socotra and other parts of Yemen is quite a jump. But maybe a similar sort of fund to actually bring people to side events and working groups and those type of things might be something that people would look at in the future, or perhaps that's already being done and I'm a little bit out of the loop. In terms of other, it's something that is likely to come up again. Just carrying on funding, and so the Cultural Protection Fund is really good at this, and we've had a couple of funds from them, and you carry on doing the same work, but you can't just keep giving external money to people in particular locations. They become dependent on it. Socotra is almost entirely dependent on external funding, and we're trying to break that cycle so that there is self-generated sustainable funding to people to do the work that, as Stephen said, they are the experts in anyway. Getting funds to develop sustainable funding mechanisms seems to be almost impossible. As a couple of other people here have said, I'm not too bad at getting successful funding bids in, but I cannot get that funded anywhere. I don't know why that is. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong places, but I'd be very interested in other people's opinions. And just finally, again, on what Stephen said, I've managed to somehow make a career out of never really publishing academic papers that only other academics will ever read. So that differentiation between research and what actually happens on the ground is at times critically misunderstood, in my opinion. And I don't really understand why that is. And again, I'd be interested in other people's opinions on that. But again, it's a cycle that needs kind of breaking. But I suspect in this cohort, that's really starting to happen.
Thank you very much, Alan. Bernadette seems to want to respond to your questions, perhaps.
Well, that probably will be too much, but I won't refer to going to the COP because I haven't been there. But I think, so, I mean, obviously, I agree with everything that has been said. I just want to add that obviously this kind of bridge between academia, what is really happening on the ground, it's very difficult to tackle. But having said that, I think what has worked in our project is having this idea that the process of the research, you know, like when you go there and do, for example, a on-site data capture for, you know, using different methods, that itself is a process of engagement. And that's a process where you can identify people who are, you know, the voices of the main voices of the community you're working with, and recognizing that all the process of the research, it's the process of engagement, and it's the process that can help to bridge this gap. In our, just to share like a good experience in our case, was that we're working with NGOs, we're working with the Gujarat Institute of Disaster Management, for example. And we included them in the project so they can identify, the idea was to identify the funding that they have locally. So instead of relying with this kind of external funding, which is very colonialistic approach of how things should be done, how they can identify local funding within their own governments to enhance the processes. And for example, with the Gujarat Institute of Disaster Management, they identified their own funding to develop disaster risk management plans, in which we are helping throughout this project to develop as part of the outcomes of the project. And we have developed together a local policy brief identifying that, which is also going to be available in different languages, in Hindi and Gujarati, so it's local and also international for the country. But what I'm trying to say is that one part of the research in our experience has been to identify what will happen with the knowledge we have created once we're gone. And if you don't share it locally, and if you don't include the people locally, then it will be just another research project, and it will be in the academic sphere with journal articles and things like that, which are not that relevant for actually producing an impact.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. Actually, when considering reevaluating concepts such as capacity building, or the notions of access and methodology, such as who gets their voices heard and how, considering what Catherine was saying about the overseas or other marginalized positionalities that Salma and others were talking about, as well as what Dr. Forrest said about the gap between academic research and practicality on the ground, I actually wanted to ask everyone on the panel to weigh in on how would you summarize in your own words, what recommendations and points would you like to see reflected in a policy brief? Where would you actually concretely like to take this forward? Perhaps Stephen from British Council could start and maybe talk a bit about the more practical aspects of maintaining partnerships, such as with the Cultural Protection Fund in East Africa and partners, or the United Cities and local governments that you've partnered with in the past. Perhaps that could be a good starting point.
Sure, I know that, right, okay. Yes, sure. Actually, that sort of maintaining partnerships, I think I'll slightly sort of adapt this. I think there's a really important thing in what Alan was saying about support for work and finding ways of that becoming sustainable in the sense of not creating sort of donor culture, if you like. And I think there's a lot to explore and a lot that needs sort of different policy understanding to support in that. And I think, you know, at the moment there's too much of a kind of policy framework that surrounds that. That's about okay, what do we see as a priority in terms of us putting together funds and getting those funds out, rather than necessarily appreciating the impact that is coming from work that's being done. And I see this, seeing this from a point of view of a cultural relations organization, and I know there's lots of different ways of understanding cultural relations, but in this instance, I don't mean this sort of cultural diplomacy end of one country seeking to share its culture. I mean it much more in the sense of cultural dialogue. Then looking at it from that point of view, you're looking at different understandings of cultural heritage and climate change and the necessities of adaptation in different contexts. Then if you extend that idea of where are the experts in that, there is an opportunity to look much more in a mutual way at learning that can come, and there's plenty of sort of exciting examples of bringing organizations together where there's shared learning that can point at different approaches in different places. So you are recognizing potentially the expertise that's coming from different places. So establishing that sort of mutuality could be encourage a different sort of policy framework and a different way of seeing funds, that they are sort of seed funding relationships rather than seeking to apply things and do things and build things, but they're encouraging a different sort of relationship. One really quick illustration around that, and it's a rather odd one in a way, but I'm involved in a project in Scotland that's sort of a kind of very immediate one, and is around, in that case, food and people's relation to food and growing. And just had a casual conversation with somebody from South Sudan about that project. And the reaction from them was, wow, that's really sad. What's really sad? Well, the idea that there are people who need reconnecting with food, where food comes from, what it means to them. I can't imagine that. That must be a really sad world. And you think, yeah, in a context of the UK, you understand why you need to do that. In another context where you don't need to do that, there's a hell of a lot of learning that can be brought in that case from South Sudan. Probably not the most immediate, the most obvious example for a cultural heritage discussion, but yeah, I think that sort of different framework around the reasons to create funds could lead to a much more sustainable approach in places where work is actually being done.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for sharing your thoughts. I see Catherine also has raised her hand to hopefully share some recommendations with us.
Thank you. I want to say how much I agree with that, and also Bernadette talking about how it's important to maintain relationships after you leave a place, to make sure that the people on the ground have the report, that they know what the findings were, and then maintain those relationships over time. But more than that, how to make a tangible difference on the ground, because too often, sometimes academia reputation in places is one of people parachute in, do their studies, does great things for their career, they have a nice vacation at the same time, and then you never hear from them again, right? And it doesn't actually make any tangible difference in those places. We've had, luckily, the National Trust here has a really good relationship with the RSPB. We consider them partners rather than they giving us capacity building. We're partners together, and they help us to protect what we have, as our natural and cultural heritage is disappearing at incredible speed. We don't have time to just do more studies or talk about it anymore. We need to protect what's there immediately. So they help us sometimes identify sources of funds that actually will pay for land preservation, for example, which is rare. People always want to fund more studies, but to actually buy land is something that's hard to do. So especially in places like where I live, where the land is super expensive. So we've managed to protect good portions of natural heritage that was at threat of being lost through those kind of partnerships. So in answer to your question, Luba, I think maintaining relationships over a long period of time and doing what you can to make sure that actual real change, real help is occurring on the ground in those places as well.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Very useful comments. Thank you very much. I think Dr. Alan Forrest raised his hand next.
I'm not sure I was next in the queue, but it might be good that I am, because I was sort of going to take myself out of the loop here, because I'm quite aware that many of my comments are based on our experiences on Socotra, which is a small and very isolated place with some quite unique problems with virtually zero internet access, amongst other things, in the context of Yemen and all of the regional influences going on there as well. So strange enough, I wanted to say actually that the report itself that we're kind of talking about has done quite well, I think, to reach some broad recommendations given on the really disparate and quite unique series of programs. And that's, yeah, I think that's, yeah, that's really all I wanted to say. There are those linkages there, and there are a load of issues there, but it's yeah, I'm aware that almost any recommendation you could make, I could tell you why Socotra is an exception to that. So it's probably best that I don't contribute too much in this case.
Thank you very much, Alan. Sama raised her hand next, so I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you, Luba. Just before answering the question, I just wanted to make a comment about what Alan was saying. I think when like growing up in Morocco and working in many countries before starting academia as an environmental engineer in the past, I feel that a lot of research is happening outside of the academic sphere, but because the academic sphere is so Western and complex and expensive, that you have a lot of things that are of knowledge that are created but shared through reports, lots of reports. Even like right now, I'm in France, and publishing is not as important than in the UK or the US. And I think it's also this, where do we look at like all the gray literature, which is when you're in the academic sphere is considered as like, you know, a secondary literature. Actually, there's so much to learn in this literature as well. Also wanted to tell that I'm really happy to hear about someone working in Socotra, because I interviewed the heritage manager in Socotra Archipelago when I was doing my PhD. I don't know if you know him, but his name was Salim Hamdia. And we were discussing about erosion and flooding in relation to the World Heritage Sites, which is the whole island. In relation,
I'm very aware of Salim Hamdia. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, great. And in relation to what Luba was saying, I think one of the elements in one of my recommendation when doing policy briefs from academic outputs is self-reflecting on how those research projects have included the social science of climate change within their understanding of how they've been assessing vulnerability, how they've been assessing risk. Because I think it's so important, from me coming from a really engineer background, going towards more social sciences, I understood that putting a context on where what's this research have been done, from which perspective this research have been done, changed a lot how you understand the output. I think also when we're talking about policy briefs is like which policymakers and which political context. Like I've done some, like you do policy briefs in Morocco, you know, no one will care about them. Like, you know, there's like things that even in the laws, they're not respected. So I think it's very important to be aware that writing policy briefs, it depends your targets and also the political environment that you're targeting with them. And I think also in policy briefs, it would be also interesting to acknowledge toxic heritage, like at least from the heritage perspective, and also how communities in a lot of places around the world and countries are being stigmatized from their own land and heritage. Something that we experience in Egypt, for example. So I think, yeah, it's really important to kind of like look at the different contexts from different perspectives in writing a policy brief or policy recommendation. And I think it's if policies can make it easier to facilitate collaborative work in areas that are not considered as nice places. Like I done my research in a really remote area that was really hard to live in, and I struggled with the UK system to actually be able to go there. I had to do so much paperwork to be able to go to a place that is not considered safe or not considered. And I think also the stigmatization of a lot of places that are highly vulnerable, but there's not much research happening there or like collaborative work happening there or funding going there because they have been stigmatized in a way that it's not safe or it's not, it might be, but I think there is also an individual responsibility that a person itself can take when deciding to work in some places. So acknowledging like this individual, like saying like decision of someone working in some areas that are not paradisiac and not nice, but actually where there is a need of more research happening there. Thank you.
So I suppose you're speaking about the autonomy of the researcher in that sense.
And the projects in a way, like the autonomy, like when you're creating a collaborative process in places that are not considered safe, like how can you take ownership of this decision? You know, yeah.
Thank you, Sama. I would like to next invite Dr. Cha. Could you please?
Thank you. I'm not sure how to cover all of this, but the first thing, kind of adding into Stefan's comments about who's experts, all those things. So from my experience of like working on adaptation fields, it has been all kind of top-down approach. So the knowledge, it's not knowledge, climate information has generated from the global level, the institutionalized, and then that kind of feeding into the national agenda and the national governance build up like what we need to do. And what is missing and what has been currently heavily criticized about the adaptation is there's no action. It's mainly because of the resource, the financial limitation, the resourcing local communities or local action bodies. They don't get enough support to deliver any action to prepare changing climate change, which will heavily affect it on their livelihood and settlements, everything. So having this kind of, our case study from our research partners, South Africa and Sri Lanka and Indonesia, they gathered a potential tool for climate change adaptation. And what we kind of appreciated about the funding was gave us more flexibility, work or learning together. So we learned quite a lot from our research partners where they do have different culture, unique culture in each side about their different climate. And then there are the local knowledge experts. So what we're delivering or supporting is a climate impact information. It's not necessarily knowledge they can use for their decision making or building their own resilience to cope with the climate change. So that was kind of like really good chance, and which we hope that kind of opportunity to, with that flexibility and with that culture of learning, co-design with the funders, academics, and the local practitioners to have in the future. So I'm not sure what kind of like this format, the funding type or formation of building this process, but that might be good opportunity to think about after this policy brief. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cha. I also like to let Bernadette take the floor.
Thank you. Just very short and following what Salma was saying, I think there is the need to recognize what she was saying about the need to recognize the political context and social aspects. I think a key issue, and I have said this before in previous workshops, for a policy brief is to understand and identify the audience. Who are you speaking to? Which I think it's very key, because what would happen, it's sometimes you need to develop several policy briefs and not only one that will fit all, because the contexts are very, very particular. And I think that's something the report is doing very well, because it has a kind of a general chapter on how to extract things that will work for all, and yet it has the individual issue briefs about the specific knowledge findings of each one of the projects that are really related to the specific conditions of each place. So I think that that kind of look going forward, it's very good.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. I would actually like now to open up the floor to anyone else who is present, not just the panelists, who would like to ask any questions or share comments, or simply share your thoughts or remarks. So is there anyone who would like to raise any remarks or comments? Francesca?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you so much for your great insights today. I have more than a comment, I have a question, from considering that we have a wonderful audience here and participants, including researchers, funding bodies, policymakers represented by DCMS, practitioners. I wanted to ask a question, because this is also a need that emerged at COP27, and that emerged in this conversation is about the fact that we need to translate academic research to a non-academic audience in order to make it relevant on the ground and to really foster change and the positive impact. And not to be modest, but I think PRAXIS, our research project, is doing very, very well in this regard, in order to transform academic research into policy brief, into research reports, in order to disseminate in these research findings to different kind of stakeholders, both within and outside academia. And this is also a question related to the continuity of funding. So PRAXIS is a research project. It's not a center, it's not a structured department within a university. So it has been extended already several times and is ending at the end of, ending at the end of February. So what do you think? We should continue this work in the future. What could be the right place, the right structure, the right model in order to continue this work and this knowledge exchange between academia and the variety of organizations working on the ground?
Rowan Jackson seems to might have an answer or a question.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's very helpful from both the research and practice point of view and the sort of perspective that I've got from people I've worked with across a range of different platforms on cultural heritage, to have a centre in effect. And I think it's having that reference point is really useful, and it speaks to the sort of sustainability dimension as well of the actual actual funding stream, that when you have an organization that effectively facilitates knowledge exchange and can be a reference point for how to do knowledge exchange practices, how to influence policy and so on, I think it really is useful, because it means, you know, I've spoken to the British Council, to AHRC, to a range of other organizations, and they'll refer to, you know, they'll refer to the University of Leeds often and their sort of strategies on things like culture and cultural heritage or international cultural relations as a way to sort of discuss how are we going to frame this issue, how are we going to frame this issue in an academic research project, but also in terms of policy and policy exchange. But I don't know whether Francesca, you might have some more insights from the other side, obviously being part of PRAXIS about that.
I noticed that Sama also has her hand up.
Yeah, I had a quick discussion with Francesca when we were at COP about that. And I think, like, working also with the managers and communities in the heritage sector, I think for now, there's no place where heritage managers can easily contact researchers and also where NGOs and other groups actually working in the culture domain and sector, like the arts, and can easily be in contact with researchers and managers at the same time. So maybe having a space allowing an easy communication between these different groups, because there are like organizations, big organizations, you know, UNESCO, like, or ICOMOS, ICROM, or like the IUCN for natural heritage sites, but there's nothing actually in relation to, at least for these subjects, climate change more specifically, and connecting these different groups. And I'm saying connecting them in an easy way to interact, ask a question, find support, find funding. I can just give an example of a heritage manager struggling, who are struggling actually in knowing where to get fund or where to whether there is risk in their sites, or they're aware of some risk, but there are they just don't have the tools to actually share about it, because they're coming from different cultures and their priorities are different. So so I think, yes, having a space where you have like an easier, non-filtered communication, like just simple and easily accessible to everyone, could be really great.
Thank you very much, Sam and Catherine. Is there something you would like to add?
Yes, just quickly. Yeah, I think that translating it into local language is, you know, obvious, but other things, I would encourage everybody in their budgets to write in education and outreach, so that you do presentations around the communities when you're done, to let everybody know what you accomplished, maybe create some infographics. And as an example, I think outside the box a lot. So I saw this thing that occurred in the Turks and Caicos, who's have a strong cultural heritage connection with conch as a food source. And it's on the way out. So they employed a local musician to create a song about conch that became super popular. And that got the word out in a way that no amount of infographics or meetings could ever have done. So thinking about how to use local outreach that you might not have thought of, you know, local young people and what they would consider a way to get the message out in a better way might be useful as well.
I also noticed that Stephen had his hand up.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I put it back down again because Catherine was saying some things I was about to say about different ways of sharing and understanding information, and the very act of building into project, the sort of very act of what do we understand about what's come from this, and how do we share that and look, and not just different languages, which I think is vital, but you know, as Catherine was saying, looking at it in different ways as well. I guess as I've got the mic, just one other thought around. I think there's been lots of good discussion. That's and there's not much I could add to it in terms of the sort of mechanisms of doing the complex thing of connecting practitioners and managers with researchers. And in all honesty, I mean, just looking at our organization, even within one organization, making sure people know what has been researched, people understand that, people are able to use, is a mammoth task. And then when you get organizations the size of some of those referenced, or it is really difficult. I guess there's also though something quite simple about it, and I wonder whether needs to be much more of when we were looking at what works, the idea of a center again came up, and I think that you try to pull people together because of their discipline or their understanding of sectors or what they do. It is always difficult to do more than just pull people who are already connected into one place. And I think the ambition should be that one of genuinely bringing in other voices, and maybe then maybe a way of doing that is to look at the themes and the geographies of work you're doing, and then around any work that's going on, looking to ensure there's space, there's time, and there's the enthusiasm to explore it, discuss it with different, and not to see that purely as an academic research exercise, but to see that as an exercise in understanding and learning more broadly. And yeah, that's part of why we sort of look at it as a program, and are looking at ways we can build in things like peer and collaborative learning to projects that we're doing.
Thank you very much for your comments, Stephen. Are there any other comments from the audience, or perhaps if James Fenner or Charlotte Marriott would also like to weigh in, our first two presenters who did our opening remarks? Do you have any comments you'd like to share? Charlotte?
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for all of the kind of discussion, and it's certainly things that I've been taking notes on and would like to come back to a few of you on. I suppose maybe just some of the sort of slightly boring side of it is with regards to the restrictions that we have in a government in terms of finance. Obviously, the CPF and many of the grants that are distributed there from that is linked to ODA, and it's linked to overseas development assistance, and that can restrict in some cases the context of where the funding can go. And I do sympathise with some of the people on the call who said, you know, that there isn't that support, and that might be something that needs to change. It's obviously not in my gift to make that happen, but as we see climate change affect more countries, whether that will be recognised. And also just on the point that was raised about research and the restrictions, see that's something that again we aren't able to change, but it's in the kind of there for your best interests. Everyone obviously had the issues with travel during the pandemic, but they got kind of all put in for a reason. But I would just encourage, if you are finding problems to get in touch with the Foreign Office, and I hope that can be resolved. But yeah, no, ultimately this has been really interesting, and just wanted to say thank you for inviting me, and look forward to working with you a bit more in the future. And in terms of the sort of future for PRAXIS, that idea of a central space for research is something that maybe when I've worked with the domestic heritage, which is more of my background, smaller organisations tended to come together in, for example, like the HEF, the Historic Environment Forum, or through the Heritage Alliance, and there really was that power in coming together and being a single voice, although of disparate voices. So perhaps in the future there may be something like that for heritage, which is more of the smaller organisations coming together, because obviously the example that you gave of sort of international heritage organisations that in with regards to climate is probably too big to just be a single voice. But I would recommend maybe there being an option there in terms of future collaboration, particularly with regards to working with the government. So anyway, that's just some thoughts from me. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I noticed that James also had his hand up as well.
Thanks, Libba. Just to echo Charlotte's comments there, really a fascinating discussion, and yeah, a lot for me to take away as well, especially around praxis as well. As you can probably appreciate and imagine, our budgets are ever more constrained, and so there is a lot of uncertainty around future funding. Having said that, though, I did want to make you all aware, though, of a new scheme that AHRC has just launched in terms of getting more ideas generated from the research community. Chat, if it will allow me. There we go. It's called Where Next? And it's essentially us asking the research community research ideas. So it's launching now, and I think I'm right in saying that the sort of first, it's a recurring process of research ideas coming in, and so the first batch, I think, are going to be collected in the spring. So please do look at that, and please do sort of feed in terms of what we've been discussing in terms of ideas around cultural heritage protection and in terms of climate change. We'd really like to have those ideas. But yeah, just to echo again, Charlotte, really fantastic discussion today, a fantastic report, and yeah, real proper official showcasing of the great work that the 9 projects are doing, and the work.
Thank you very much,
Crystal
James.
And Praxis particularly. So yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. With only a few minutes left to spare, I'll give the last word to Alan.
That's a bit of a worry. And very, very quickly. So within my research career lifetime, which is slightly longer than I care to admit, the move from doing quite academic work requiring a very nice academic CV to everything being overseas development assistance compliance, for me, is a massive step forwards. It brings a level of due diligence in terms of finance and agenda and ethics that has not always been there in the research community. So I very, very much welcome that.
Thank you very much, Alan. I kind of, just to wrap up in the last minute we have, I just want to thank everyone for being here with us today and partaking in this stimulating discussion. It was our absolute pleasure to share our report and our thoughts on COP27 with all of you, and to hear from the amazing speakers, panelists, and other discussants. It is incredible to have been part of this space that brought together interested parties from funding bodies, policymakers, academics, practitioners, and other interested stakeholders. And you all took part and contributed to such a stimulating and hopefully, I hope you view it as well as a constructive discussion. So the future steps of this webinar are the preparation, as I said, of this policy brief, because we don't want it to just end here. We would actually like to try to move it forward and see where it can go. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts about how to write it, how to construct it, as well as some of the content that could possibly go in it. If anyone is interested in participating or sharing additional thoughts, please feel free to contact me after the event. I will be happy to share additional information with you. Thank you again for being here and being part of this event. Have a great afternoon, and as we say in my mother language, Bulgarian, do vijdane, or till we meet again.